Hello, everyone. Today on the Social Mind, we're talking art and creativity. Now, when we think about art, it always comes across as something that one may perceive as painting or drawing or somebody doing something for an exhibition. Now, if a child says he or she wants to be an artist, their parents may not think that's a noble profession, right? However, art, in my mind, is anything like writing, reading. It's a skill that one acquires. So today, I have with me a colleague and a friend, Mr. Asha Mains, and we were talking art and creativity. Now, Asha, before we get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Asher Mains. I'm heavily involved in art in Grenada and internationally. I lecture at St. George's University, a sprinkling of humanities. I teach philosophy, English, and art, of course. I am currently the president of Grenada Arts Council. I started Art School Greens a few years ago, which is essentially digestible art classes for adults, affordable and short. And then I'm the resident director of Art House 473 in Caliste, where we have events, exhibits, classes, etc. I think that might be it as far as I'm currently pursuing a PhD in philosophy, so that will be added into all of the other art activity.
Lovely. I suspected that philosophy was leading in some direction in the artistic area. As I mentioned in my intro, most parents, if their child says that they want to be an artist, like I mentioned, they may not think it's a fancy or a noble profession. And when we think about an art, yes, I personally in the past I thought about us drawing and painting. And once upon a time, I used to say I have no artistic skills in me in terms of drawing or painting. That has long gone out the window. So tell me, Asha, explain what art is and how we can get people to think of art more than just passing time or something that is done for an exhibition.
Yeah. One of my favorite ways to set up this argument is the case for literacy, because no one would argue that children shouldn't learn to read, right?
Absolutely.
Engaging in visual communication is a similar pursuit as far as being able to be a good consumer and producer of any sort of visual element. And we have them all over. Look around your room, everything that has been designed was drawn first or had some sort of two-dimensional, manifestation before it became a chair or a desk or, take your pick. And so that at a base level, is an argument to say, just as we wouldn't prevent a child from learning to read, because what could you do by reading books? Right. What are you going to do for a job? You just sit down and read? It's the same for art, as far as there are skills, there are methods, there are processes to learn. The same way that when you learn to read, you take on, another modality in terms of interacting with the world, etc. It's the same for art. So even if it doesn't become a vocation, it's still absolutely, you're talking about passing time, a legitimate avocation. So even as you may be, someone who's, let's call them text-based, maybe you do research, maybe you spend a lot of time reading words, you can also have, lines of inquiry that may be more visual because of your visual literacy via art.
Yeah, absolutely. But some would argue that, like in the Grenadian context, we sort of neglect art and we don't pay much attention to it. And in recent times, I understood that some schools are removing it from their curriculum. Can you speak, let's say, to the value of art for society, for the creativity of individuals, and as I mentioned, just beyond exhibitions? Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. Not to get overly political with the thought, and of course, I do have thoughts about our education system as it is. Making art or even engaging in the process is a revolutionary act. Why? Because most of our education is set up for us to become consumers consumers of information and not producers. And to become a producer, this is what, to me, a post-colonial position looks like, is to ask questions in terms of what is it that we're being taught in school? Why is it so highly technical? And why does it seem like we're being restricted from things like poetry, music, dance, art, all these things that are important contributions to us as humans and help us to not only express things that may be intangible, like it's not as easy to write an expository essay about the way that you feel about something. It gives you another channel. It gives you another way of bringing something into the world, whether it's a thought, whether it's a concept, an idea, or whether you're drawing attention to something in society. Art can perform those things in ways that other avenues cannot.
Absolutely. So my follow-up question would be then, can you link some of the skills to things that we might ignore or may not consider to involve the visual arts? For example, when we think of the movies or a movie, we don't think about art. When we think about fashion or design of clothing, and as you mentioned earlier, our houses, how we design it, interior design, even our smartphones, when we think of those things, we do not think of art in terms of how we use and how we consume them. Can you link some of the skills that we really don't consider that the visual art is actively involved?
Absolutely.
Because we engage in it, but we don't pay attention to it as much.
Yeah. And of course, there's too many links to list them all. But I do think that the pandemic the pandemic was a very revealing time in terms of where people turn their attentions to. Ironically, during the pandemic, I saw an article come out, I think of The Guardian, that was listing, top 10 professions and then like bottom 10 professions. And of course, in the bottom 10, you might see artist or designer. But at the same time, somebody had to design that infographic for them to post. And so somebody had a job doing that. And it would have been based in, the psychology of how we perceive things, the psychology of how information is spread, design, elements that makes things easy to read or at least, digestible. A lot of the things that people learn in an art education, I'm thinking, very broadly, 2D, 3D, spoken word, etc., movement. A lot of things taught, coincide with the fact that we are complex beings, right? One of the intelligences, for example, being visual spatial. We need to encourage children who seem to have a propensity for doing well with space. We're doing well in terms of thinking of how things look in their mind and then translate it to a surface and then translate that to something else. And that's when we're talking architects, we're talking pilots, we're talking, engineers, welders, take a pick of anyone that needs to visualize something. They would benefit from having, arts in their education. And again, just as a by the way, this is a little bit of a tangent. They do say the vast majority of Nobel Prize winners have music in their background, almost without exception. Because music is mathematical. Music is also expressive. It appeals, again, to our complex nature, as opposed to you need to learn these facts or you need to memorize these dates. This is something that involves our whole selves, as far as talking about art in general. And so, I'm sad to hear that they've taken art classes out of some schools. And I've heard the rationale is that not enough people were going to take, CXC or CSEC for art as a subject. But again, that's a terrible reason to take it off the table, to say, well, they're not going and taking the exam, so we're not investing in that part of their, development, ultimately is what they're saying. I have thoughts about CSEC anyway, so that's a by the way.
We'll digress. So as you mentioned that, there is a lot of talk about in recent times about the creative industry and the creative economy. If we are removing art, for example, out of our schools, what would you say then would be the relationship, or is the relationship between the creative industry, visual culture and society, because we make up the society. We are the artists, we are the dancers, the musicians, and how can that, or how would that impact us in terms of policies, our identities, economics, because the creative industry, it does bring in some money. The musicians, right? The theater, as I mentioned, yes, that is a way to build the economy. But then if we are removing creativity from our schools, and we are sort of training our students to be robots, because you have to memorize, and we have this concept of rote learning, which is so outdated. And there, when you do that, person's analytical and critical thinking skill is not developed. Art contributes towards that. So if we're removing that, and we want the students to do well in mathematics, in physics, in chemistry, and we want there's a lot of talk about global warming and so on. Us in this part of this world, in this hemisphere, we have to now think of how we're going to redesign our houses, because it's just getting hotter and hotter. So I probably went on that rant because I just, for the life of me, I can't fathom why it's being removed, because it is who we are. I mean, just how we walk is an artistic way. The entire human body is the most intricate piece of art. And so we have to be able to connect those things. So I will repeat the question, because I know I went off on a tantrum, right? What would be the relationship between the creative industry, visual culture, visual arts, culture and society, and its impact on policies such as our identity, economics, and of course our education system? So can you help me to understand this?
Right. And of course, it's a very complex question because there's lots of moving parts, as I say. I do like to use metaphors and analogies, to talk about some of these things, because people do have a tendency to kind of put art in its own little box off to the side, as if it doesn't interconnect with everything else. One of the analogies I like to use when talking about, especially development of artists and the industry, is to use food, right? So all of us at some point learn to cook for ourselves. We've been cooked for a long time, and then, we grew up and we learned to cook for ourselves, and we should be cooking things that we like, right? Why would we make things for ourselves that we don't like? So this is analogous to, your creative practice. As you improve, you share your food with friends, with family. Before long, if this really is your passion, this is what you've spent your time, perfecting as far as a craft, and people like what you're making, soon enough, strangers will be coming and they want to have what you have, right? So you've built up, you've developed, and now you're able to offer something unique to the world. And that could look like a restaurant, or, a food stand, or a food truck, or, take your pick. Same for art, as far as you develop a practice over years, no matter what the discipline or media is, and you get to a place where people now, let's say from the outside even, talking about visitors coming in and buying artwork and so on the island, you've gone through a process where you've fallen into a system that recognizes what you're doing and is able to support it. So of course the allegory there is, for people who've spent time developing, we do need galleries, and we need museums. We desperately need a national art museum. We need those end goals for people to see, where you can get to, but also steps along the way. You could go to culinary school, you could go to art school. There's similar trajectories. You don't need to be formally trained in art, which is, a benefit. There's lots of ways to learn informally, and you could, by following good processes, end up in a place where you're producing good results. And that's another thing that gets confused from kind of like an outside-in perspective. Of course, we make products. You can see one of my paintings behind me, but that's also the result of a process, and that kind of methodology is important, as far as not just for producing artists or creatives, etc., but for anyone to see something from the start to finish in terms of making something happen. As it pertains to the creative industry in Grenada, and without getting too specific, one of the biggest, trying to think of how to word it, offerings we could get by way of policy would be for foreign investors, particularly hotels, when they are putting artwork into their spaces, they have to have Grenadian art. Whether it's 100%, 50%, this would be a career-changing policy for many artists, because if you're able to in one go sell 40 pieces of whatever you've made, that creates that sustainable environment where you can have a reasonable expectation that you can keep working, and people will continue to invest in Grenada, and people will continue to invest in your artwork.
Your art.
Yeah, and there's other ways to do that. As far as I think Trinidad already does. You can do a tax concession if you're a person that collects art and you spent $10,000 this year buying art. You say on your taxes, and I know our tax system is a little simpler. You just say I bought art, and so you don't have to add that to your total income. You write it off, and that would help as far as making it easier for people to collect art, or at least incentivizing, particularly corporate business entities, because they usually have budgets for this sort of thing. In the US, I believe every public building has to have 10% of its total budget for public art. So that's why you see so many sculptures out in front of these places. And yeah, so some help in terms of regularizing that sort of consumption as far as the collectors go would absolutely help on the creative front. Because right now, we have pros and cons to being fairly unregulated. Brazil, for example, has a 40% tax on art. And so, we're lucky not to have that sort of imposition. Yeah. Right. But at the same time, just as we have a system, like I was referring to with food, restaurants, and so on, that's a whole ecology, let's call it. We don't have that right now for art in Grenada. And so setting that up as far as more places to distribute, more places to, buy the work, etc. Yeah.
Absolutely. I recently, well, not recently, last year, middle of last year, May, thereabouts, June, July, thereabout, I visited Venice, and there was the biennale being happening at the same time. So I was very proud when I walked into the space and I saw Grenada on it. But then when the reality, the more I ponder on how we treat the visual art in particular in Grenada, it's sort of disappointing, because when I checked the visitors log, there was a lot of people who visited the Grenada pavilion. And that is a way also of marketing Grenada and getting persons or tourists to come to Grenada. So it's not just the art, the Grenadian art was on exhibition, but there once it's done continuously and we have producers, you can have a wide variety of the artists, because each person is or each artist has a different experience. When I look at your paintings, I am seeing something totally different from what the artist has done. And if you have 10 other persons or people around, if you have 10 people around, then each of us is seeing something different. And that's where the creativity, then you have a discussion about it, because it evokes emotion. Right? And if you're going to compare it in food, as you mentioned, the culinary of food, it has to be aesthetically pleasing to the eye, not just for taste. How you set it out on your plate, all of that is art. So, like I said, we are engaged in artistic activities daily, but we seem to have that disconnect. We're not connecting it as the visual art, because if I go to a particular restaurant, any restaurant for that matter, and the food is not laid out in a particular way, I cannot consume it, because it is not aesthetically pleasing to me.
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
we have to be able to think of I guess the visual art in a
Hmm.
much broader
Hmm.
context than we I suppose we look at it in this part of the world. I tell you, when I
Hmm.
walked in there to that Grenadian pavilion in Venice, I was the most proud Grenadian, and there were a
Hmm.
few other tourists. I suppose they were from Europe as well. I was like, yes,
Hmm.
that's my country, and then we started a discussion. Where is Grenada? And I then had to be the tour guide then,
Yeah.
So it could, like, in terms of the economic activities, art could
Hmm.
have a much, I suppose, in my mind, and you can correct me. I think that it can boost the tourism economy in terms of our identity. It gives us something
Hmm.
to be proud of. It will be
Absolutely.
part of our heritage. And as you mentioned, we don't have like museum and so on. And when the ironic thing, I might be rambling here.
Very good.
The ironic thing, though, is that when we travel to other places, we want to go to the museums. We want to
Right.
see people's art. We want to see sculptures. When we take a picture, when we go
Hmm.
to New York, the Statue of Liberty, that
Right.
is art. And so we sort of not, I suppose we're not connecting it in those ways when we come to Grenada. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe, I don't know, the Sancy Sun is not going to really do it, because you could find it anywhere in my mind in the Caribbean. And
Hmm.
but if we I suppose, like the arts in general, whether it's
Yeah.
drama, whether it's theater,
Hmm.
I think that we are a very, even if we don't get those avenues, like in a particular space, we don't do it daily, we still have that creativity. Could you imagine if we have that space and that freedom, how we would
Mm.
just take off? That's just
Yeah,
my
absolutely.
thinking for us, because we have so much skills and talents that's just waiting to be honest. And I guess that's my bias
Mhm.
in terms of being
Right.
Grenadian. So
Yeah.
one more. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that,
Well,
but
I liked your the point you made a little while ago in terms of bringing different perspectives, because that's something I deal with in my work, and of course, Dr. Benoit, who you have behind you,
I had right.
deals with it also in
And
terms of this
exactly.
opacity, this obscurity, um, this position that art can provoke in terms of not being clear and needing more inquiry, which of course is, a good component of critical thinking, but also something that is hard to teach outside of these more like poetic or artistic realms, is how to handle ambiguity and complexity.
A complex,
You know,
right?
that's not something that we see coming out of secondary school, because again, the emphasis is so much on passing certain exams in a certain way because of your memorization skills, versus right, like if you walk into a room, can you make sense of what's happening visually, without becoming extremely literal, but at least being able to have the vocabulary, rather than just saying, going back again to the literacy example, I can't read it, or I can't, art
Carried
doesn't
it.
make sense to
Yeah.
me. I don't know what it means. And maybe it doesn't mean one thing.
Right.
Maybe it means what you're bringing to it, and then that frustration you're feeling is what it could mean, because
Exactly.
and that's something that you have to
Exactly.
process through and hopefully
Absolutely.
develop tools to do better and better every time you come up to a complexity or ambiguity. And
Absolutely.
just to note on the Venice Biennale, of course, I'm glad that you were able to get there. A
Yeah.
huge thing for Grenada, particularly because other Caribbean countries aside from Cuba have not been as many times as Grenada. We've had 4
Grenada.
iterations
I've
since
I've
2015.
noticed.
And so we really have, set ourselves up in the region as far as this is the place where contemporary art is coming out of, but also, having the environment and the administrative capacity to be able to show up in Venice every 2 years. This year we had 100,000 visitors to the pavilion during the 7 months. And of course, it's sometimes hard to like, sorry, something fell on the shelf. Sometimes
That's
it's hard to
okay.
fathom like that kind of number, and of course that's our population. 100,000 in 7 months is as if the brewery, West Indies Brewery, was filled to 500 people every day for 7 months, which of course I don't think 500 people could fit inside. But that's the volume, and again, that's the amount of people who had exposure to and recognized Grenada, not only at the highest level of contemporary art in the world, but also sharing authentic parts of ourselves. This year, of course, we did Shakespeare Mass from Carriacou, and different perspectives on that from different artistic angles and so on. So yeah, again, happy that you were able to visit, and can't express enough what a big impact that potentially can have over the next few years.
And you see me grinning from cheek to cheek, because like I tell you, my identity in that moment, I was the ambassador for Grenada there, even if I was a visitor in the space as well. And I did make new friends. They did come to Grenada or visited Grenada during the Christmas break. So I am thinking, like I mentioned earlier, in my mind, if this is done properly with I guess with the right process or mechanisms in place, and we could have a lot more artists. And I am thinking, if I as a single person visited that space, the pavilion, and I could have gotten 6 people to visit Grenada, can you imagine? I got 2 families to visit Grenada. So I'm thinking we have something there that we really need to I suppose look deeper into. In terms of, I guess my final question would be like, since I know you mentioned earlier that one doesn't have to be trained in art per se, like formal training in art, but since the visual art isn't taught from a young age, and I'm thinking that's where you're most creative, because your mind is like a sponge, just pulling everything, and your analytical and critical thinking skills, I suppose, can be developed through art. So since the visual art is not taught from a young age throughout our primary education, my final question: what advice do you have about art education, the visual arts, and how can it be taken more seriously as one would study for any profession? A doctor, a lawyer, an archaeologist, a sociologist.
Right.
Yeah. So how do we get it in the Grenadian context to like from an early age? How do we deal with that as a society?
I would probably advise differently depending on different stages and where they want to go with it, etc. One of the things I tell people, because of course my mother is an artist, I grew up in a very creatively supportive home. She never tried to make me an artist. She never tried to like push me down that road. But she also didn't deny me any use of materials that were around, or if I wanted to try something, I was fortunate because I know the majority of people at some point have experienced a level of shame when it comes to especially creative pursuits, whether it's, there's no money in art, or, don't waste your time singing, take your pick. And so even in art education myself, I'm aware of this, and that's something that we have to unpack a little bit in terms of getting to a place where you can explore this, I call it, it's a method. It really is a method of engaging with reality, whether it's trying to represent something that you see across from you, or whether you have an idea or you had a dream. Art is just a method of bringing all of these things into a place where you can share it with people and have feedback and so on. And of course, again, going back to literacy, I don't think anyone really would have a problem if children became amazing storytellers because they told stories as a child. It seemed very sad.
A picture drawing.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing. It's in terms of the metaphor. We do a lot of damage in early childhood education with trying to put these very arbitrary and strange constraints on children. You notice it even in textbooks. Early on you see lots of images, and children learn a lot through that. It's a very fast way to learn. And then images become less and less of a thing as you go through the grades or the classes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And there's this idea that if you are an intellectual, then you just do everything in your head and maybe typing, but basically it's between these two modes. And there are more ways of knowing, even talking about like walking around aimlessly as an artistic practice, because you might notice things about the world that you wouldn't have noticed unless you took that long, meandering walk. These are all within the realm of thinking more poetically, more holistically about our complex nature, or the complexity of being a human. Thinking about advice for artists who are, let's say, wanting to make it their vocation. One of the best things you can do is try to find someone who has a little bit more experience. And when I say a little bit more, maybe a lot more, just to help guide, because we see a lot of young artists making some of the same steps and so on, and you really don't have to reinvent the wheel as far as just making it up for yourself. There are people that have some good advice and so on. There are outlets here and there in terms of joining with others in community. That's one of the best ways. And of course, if you're absolutely, kind of isolated, or you feel like you're on your own, the internet has lots of ways of learning, and also lots of ways of connecting with other people. And it's just a matter of saying, this is something that I'm not going to be able to do alone, because, like with anything, I'd like to engage with others, whether it's just to share or to learn, or, otherwise move forward. Again, it goes back to food. You can't make your first cheese sandwich and go out saying, I'm gonna sell this, because that's a normal cheese sandwich anyone could make. But if over the years you spend time perfecting it, and only you can make this the way you do, again, through sharing, through feedback, through trying to gain new skills and so on, you could come up with something where people are looking for this person that makes the magical cheese sandwich, and they're willing to pay, $30 for it and all of that. But again, it's part of a long process. And I encourage, especially young artists, to engage with the process rather than think from the start, I'm going to be making things to sell, if that makes sense.
Right.
I mean, you mentioned economically.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it is worth mentioning, art is an economic anomaly. When we talk about a tube of paint, might cost $20, some canvas, some money. But what you're able to, after you've gone through this process, sell it for, there's no other material that we deal with that has that sort of, like upgrade in terms of selling the materials.
Value.
Yeah, exactly.
Value.
We create value, we create meaning and value. And again, those are things that it'd be hard to argue that doesn't have a place in society for.
I mean, it has its place. I mean, our landscape. I mean, nature in and of itself is art. Oh, just when you let's drive back to Grenada, since that's what we were talking about. If you go at the top of, let's say, PVC or Convent, and you look down at the Carnage, there is when we make sense of the space, there is something that I mean, I'm not an artist, so I can't express it the way an artist would. But you would see a lot of artists probably doing the painting of the Carnage because it's doing something. It is evoking some form of emotion or some memory. It is evoking feelings, right? So, I mean, like I said, the way we dress, everybody wants to be in the latest fashion. Yeah, makeup, putting on makeup is an artistic form. You play carnival; it's an artistic form. So we cannot, I suppose, operate in silos and not make that connection in terms of the visual art. I think I would argue that every child, every person, male or female, he or she should really try to explore the visual art, because I can only speak for myself and other colleagues. I mean, I took art classes. I learned about the history of art first. I took those classes because it gives you some context into the past.
Yeah.
Right. So when you look at all the major artists, it's like, where was that creativity coming from in terms of the technology? Because we would think that they didn't have the technology that we have now, but we are not really creating anything much more granular than they did. In terms of if we use architecture, for example, some of the buildings that were built 5, 6, 100 years ago are still standing strong. They
Yeah.
didn't have that technology,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still there. And if we use let's say the Grenada Parliament, that building is
Yeah.
still
Mhm.
sturdy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it came out of slavery. So 300 years ago, and it's still there. And all the modern structures that we built
Mm-hmm.
are taken down. So we
Yeah.
have to be able to, I suppose, connect
Mm-hmm.
connect to visual arts, because we like our lawn looking nice. We want
Mm-hmm.
flowers. We want that is part of art. That is part of the creative process or processes
Mm-hmm.
that,
Mm-hmm.
again, as you rightfully said, we do not take it into consideration. We think it's just
Mm-hmm.
about the drawing or the painting.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, even sewing
Mhm.
is an art. Being a tailor, being a seamstress,
Yeah. Yeah.
is part of the visual and creative
Yeah.
processes. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
I like what you, yeah, I like what you said
yeah,
about art
yeah.
history, because again, that is teaching a methodology as far as I think about a lot in terms of creating the context for any idea, or art history as kind of a visual record of human thought, because that's not even taught all the time. In philosophy, I'm always looking at the geography, the cultural, the historical,
So
elements going on at the time to see how something's produced. And art history intersects with philosophy and religion and culture and all those things.
everything,
And so,
yeah,
absolutely a
yeah.
relevant thing to look into. Absolutely, and it teaches you a
Yeah,
way of thinking through different
I
things.
think yeah, that's what it did for me, actually. Because
Mm-hmm.
when I took history of Western art, I mean, I took all the art classes. I might have mentioned that on another program,
Mm-hmm.
on another one of the other shows. But I took a lot of the history classes, of art
Mm-hmm.
classes,
Mm-hmm.
because, like I mentioned, I didn't think that I had any artistic bone
Yeah.
in my body. But when it gives you context into, I mean, could you imagine sitting down, let's say, with why Socrates is having his one of his discussion, and you're there
Mm-hmm.
in the courtyard,
Mm-hmm.
and somebody's doing that drawing or that painting,
Mm-hmm.
Michelangelo. I mean, where did they get that creative process? We see all
Yeah.
the big churches when you travel, or the big buildings. I mean, like the
Mm-hmm.
architecture, as I mentioned, somebody has to put it together,
Yeah.
as you said
Yeah.
earlier. And
Mm-hmm.
if we want our we in recent time, I was speaking to a colleague, and well, I was doing a training with this particular company, and they were saying, the manager was saying that the workers are not creative. You have to tell them everything to do. And
Mm-hmm.
I suppose, coming out from academia, I said, but we're the one that did that. And I'm
Yeah.
saying we because it's part of the education process. Because
Mm-hmm.
when they question you in the various classes, you say, oh, you don't need to know this. So every time you tell
Mm-hmm.
them no, they don't need to know this, they pull back, they draw
Mm-hmm.
back. So they have less and less expectation of what they need to do. It's like, oh, I just need to study this chapter.
Right. Right.
And
For a
then you
multiple choice
regurgitate
something.
it.
Yeah.
Right. You regurgitate it, and then you choose A, B, or C. That is not
Yeah.
part of the creative or analytical thinking. So, of course, when you
Right.
go to work, if somebody doesn't tell you what to do, if you're not critical, if you're
Mm-hmm.
not analytical, if you don't know how to take initiative, it's just not going to happen. So
Yeah.
sometimes we have false expectations of persons who we hire. They may look good on paper, yes,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because they did the formal education. But in terms
Mm-hmm.
of carrying it out, then that is
Yeah.
part of the problem. So I am
Mm-hmm.
arguing here, as we wrap up, and
Yeah.
correct me, I am arguing here. In my previous show, I talk about drama as therapy. This
Okay.
time, I'm talking about the visual arts,
Mm-hmm.
and there is a connection in terms of arts education and drama education. It
Mm-hmm.
helps individuals to express themselves. It helps to develop the creative, analytical, and thinking processes.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
um, I am pushing. I don't know who's listening, but I hope we can take a much broader look, not just at the visual arts. I
Mm-hmm.
know that's what we're talking about today, but all aspects of the of art.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that. We can
Just
share
what you're
that
saying
and then
there. Mhm. Yeah, and then I
wrap
can.
up. Yeah, yeah.
Just
Go
as far
ahead.
as one of the soft skills, like you said, in terms of because employers want to see the soft skills, that's what comes out over and over again. A person's ability to lead and present, and a lot of things that aren't taught the same way that our facts are taught. In any case, one of the most important skills to me across vocations is pattern recognition. The ability to see patterns not only in behavior, but also going business. Consumer behavior is recognizing patterns. Music teaches you to recognize patterns. Of course, we can think of patterns as a very visual thing in art, but also there are patterns of ways of doing things. And if that's one thing you're able to extract from an art education is a higher, sensitivity to patterns, I guarantee whatever field you're in, that's going to manifest in a positive way.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of The Social Mind. Today we're talking art and creativity. As I mentioned in my introduction, people always say they cannot draw, but they never really say they cannot read or they cannot write, right? So think of art as a process, as the same learning process as one would learn to read and one
Mhm.
would learn to write. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you guys very much. And I will see you next week for another episode of The Social Mind.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. All right.